I saw my sister and she said, "You have to go home." I have chills even talking about it. Instantly I knew something was wrong. I didn't quite pinpoint it yet because
For 47 years, Elvis Presley's coffin has remained one of the most fiercely protected burial sites in American history. Not because of what everyone assumes is inside, but because of the questions that have never stopped swirling around it. Graceland's meditation garden, where Elvis supposedly rests beside his parents and grandmother, attracts millions of visitors who come to pay respects, leave flowers, and stand in quiet reverence before the bronze plaque bearing his name. But beneath the surface of that peaceful scene, a different kind of energy has always hummed. The persistent, uncomfortable whisper that something about the official story doesn't quite add up. Recently, that whisper became impossible to ignore. A coalition of forensic scientists, medical researchers, and representatives from the Presley estate reached an agreement that would have seemed unthinkable just a few years ago. Using advanced imaging technology that didn't exist when Elvis died in 1977, they would conduct a non-invasive examination of his coffin. The stated goal was straightforward enough: to settle certain medical questions, update historical records, and potentially provide closure to decades of speculation. But everyone involved understood the real weight of what they were doing. This examination could either confirm what the world has believed for nearly half a century, or it could crack open a mystery that refuses to stay buried. The pressure for this kind of investigation had been building for decades, though it rarely made mainstream headlines. Conspiracy theorists had long demanded proof that Elvis was actually in that grave, pointing to irregularities in the original burial that they claimed warranted serious scrutiny. Most of these voices were easy to dismiss as obsessive fans, unwilling to accept their hero's death. But mixed among them were forensic professionals, medical examiners, and researchers who raised questions that weren't so simple to wave away. They pointed to the rushed autopsy, the sealed medical records that remained locked away for decades, the conflicting testimonies from people who were present at Graceland on the night Elvis died. None of this proved anything on its own, but taken together, it created a pattern of uncertainty that legitimate investigators found troubling. What changed the equation was technology. Modern forensic science has developed imaging techniques capable of revealing detailed information about sealed containers without ever disturbing their contents. Ground-penetrating radar, density analysis, and advanced scanning methods can now determine the composition, weight distribution, and structural characteristics of objects that would have been completely opaque to investigators in 1977. When these capabilities reached a certain threshold of reliability, the arguments for examining Elvis's coffin shifted from theoretical to practical. It was no longer a question of whether such an examination was possible, but whether anyone would have the courage and the authorization to conduct one. The morning the examination took place, Graceland's grounds were closed to the public under the pretense of routine maintenance. A small team of specialists arrived before dawn, their equipment transported in unmarked vehicles to avoid attracting attention. The atmosphere was tense in a way that surprised even the scientists involved. These were professionals who had examined crime scenes, disaster sites, and historical remains without flinching. But something about this particular assignment felt different. They weren't just analyzing physical evidence. They were touching the third rail of American cultural mythology. Whatever they found would either validate the beliefs of millions or shatter them entirely. The initial setup took longer than expected. Calibrating the equipment to account for the specific conditions of the burial site required adjustments that hadn't been necessary in previous examinations. The soil composition, the depth of the grave, the materials used in the coffin's construction, all of these factors had to be precisely measured before any meaningful data could be collected. By the time the first scans began, the sun had risen over Graceland, casting long shadows across the meditation garden, where tourists would normally be gathering for their first glimpse of Elvis's final resting place. What happened next would set off a chain of events that no one involved had fully anticipated. The lead forensic examiner, a woman with 30 years of experience in non-invasive burial analysis, was the first to notice that something wasn't right. Her initial readings showed density patterns that didn't match the expected profile for human remains interred for 47 years. The weight distribution within the coffin appeared inconsistent with standard burial configurations. These discrepancies might have had mundane explanations, variations in embalming techniques, memorial items placed alongside the body, unusual coffin construction materials. A phone call was placed to estate representatives before any further scans were conducted. The conversation was brief, but witnesses described the forensic examiner's expression shifting from professional concern to something closer to genuine alarm. Whatever she had seen in those preliminary readings, it was enough to transform what should have been a routine verification into something far more complicated. The question everyone had been asking for decades is, Elvis, really in that coffin, suddenly felt less like conspiracy theory and more like a legitimate scientific inquiry demanding answers. The technology being used that morning at Graceland represented the cutting edge of forensic science, equipment so sophisticated that it could map the internal structure of sealed containers down to the millimeter. Ground-penetrating radar combined with advanced density analysis allowed investigators to essentially see through solid materials, creating detailed three-dimensional models of what lay beneath without disturbing a single grain of soil. These weren't experimental tools wielded by amateur enthusiasts hoping to prove a conspiracy theory. They were the same methodologies used by law enforcement agencies, archaeological teams, and international forensic organizations to solve cases that had gone cold for decades. When applied to Elvis Presley's coffin, they were expected to provide definitive answers that would silence speculation once and for all. Instead, they created more questions than anyone had bargained for. The first significant anomaly appeared in the density readings, which showed that the coffin's contents possessed a different mass profile than what forensic science would predict for human remains interred since 1977. Organic material decomposes in relatively predictable ways over time, and experienced examiners can estimate what they should find based on burial conditions, embalming methods, and elapsed years. The readings from Elvis's coffin fell outside those expected parameters in ways that the lead examiner described as statistically notable. This didn't prove anything extraordinary on its own, but it was unusual enough to warrant immediate documentation and further analysis. The weight discrepancy proved even more puzzling when subjected to detailed calculation. Based on the scanning data, the estimated total weight of the coffin's contents appeared inconsistent with standard burial profiles for a man of Elvis's documented size. The variance wasn't enormous, but in forensic terms, it was significant, the kind of difference that would prompt investigators in any other context to ask hard questions about what they were actually looking at. Estate representatives present during the examination reportedly grew visibly uncomfortable as the technical team discussed these findings among themselves, their professional shorthand becoming increasingly animated. Historical context gave these anomalies additional weight that couldn't be easily dismissed. The circumstances surrounding Elvis's original burial had generated suspicion almost immediately after his death, with witnesses and insiders raising concerns that were never adequately addressed. Several people who viewed Elvis's body during the brief open casket period at Graceland reported that something seemed off about his appearance. His complexion looked artificial. His features seemed subtly wrong, and the overall presentation struck some observers as more theatrical than funerary. At the time, these impressions were attributed to grief, shock, and the disorienting nature of viewing someone so famous in such vulnerable circumstances. But the examination findings gave these old testimonies new relevance, suggesting that perhaps those witnesses had perceived something genuine that deserved more serious consideration. The decision to conduct secondary verification scans came quickly, driven by a recognition that preliminary findings this unusual required additional confirmation before anyone could responsibly discuss them. A second team of specialists was brought in to repeat the analysis using slightly different methodologies, providing an independent check on the original data. The estate insisted on this additional step, understanding that whatever conclusions emerged would face intense public scrutiny and needed to be bulletproof against accusations of error or bias. For nearly 6 hours, Graceland's meditation garden became an active forensic site, with technicians running calculations and comparing results, while security personnel maintained a perimeter against any possibility of outside observation. When the secondary examination concluded, the findings proved troublingly consistent with the initial scans. Both analyses showed the same density anomalies, the same weight discrepancies, and the same departure from expected burial profiles. One forensic specialist reportedly described the results as inconclusive in ways that are themselves significant, a careful phrasing that acknowledged the limits of what the technology could prove, while refusing to dismiss what it had revealed. Another team member declined to sign the preliminary report, requesting additional time to analyze the data before committing her professional reputation to any official conclusion. Something in that coffin, or perhaps something conspicuously absent from it, had transformed what should have been a straightforward verification into a genuine forensic puzzle. The scientists had come to Graceland expecting to confirm the obvious and end decades of speculation with hard evidence. Instead, they departed with encrypted data files, preliminary reports marked confidential, and the uncomfortable awareness that Elvis Presley's final resting place held secrets that modern technology could detect but not yet explain. Long before forensic scientists arrived at Graceland with their advanced imaging equipment, the theories about Elvis Presley's death had already taken on a life of their own. For nearly 5 decades, a dedicated community of researchers, fans, and self-proclaimed investigators had insisted that the official story contained gaps too significant to ignore. Some believed Elvis had faked his death to escape the crushing pressure of fame, retreating into anonymity, while the world mourned a man who was actually sipping coffee somewhere in quiet obscurity. Others constructed more elaborate narratives involving witness protection programs, government operations, or medical experiments that required Elvis to disappear from public life entirely. These theories varied wildly in their plausibility, but they shared one common foundation: the conviction that what happened in August 1977 was not as straightforward as the authorities claimed. The examination findings breathed new oxygen into speculation that many had dismissed as the desperate fantasies of people unable to accept loss. Suddenly, the density anomalies and weight discrepancies documented by legitimate forensic professionals gave theorists something they had always lacked: scientific data suggesting that official accounts might be incomplete. Online communities that had kept these discussions alive for decades experienced a surge of new interest, with longtime researchers feeling vindicated after years of being mocked as conspiracy obsessives. The findings didn't prove their theories correct, but they accomplished something almost as valuable in their eyes. They proved that the questions themselves deserved serious consideration. What makes Elvis unique among celebrity death conspiracies is the sheer volume of circumstantial evidence that theorists have accumulated over the years. The misspelled middle name on his original grave marker, where Aaron appeared instead of the Iran that Elvis himself used throughout his life, struck many observers as an error too fundamental to be accidental. The life insurance policy that Elvis maintained, reportedly worth millions, was allegedly never claimed by his estate, a detail that seemed inexplicable if his death was genuine, but perfectly logical if he had orchestrated his own disappearance. Sightings accumulated over the decades, with witnesses across the country reporting encounters with elderly men who bore striking resemblances to an aged Elvis, some of them occurring in locations that seemed too coincidental to dismiss entirely. None of this evidence would satisfy a court of law or a peer-reviewed scientific journal, but it created a pattern that sustained belief across generations of devoted investigators. The examination findings slotted into this existing framework as the most significant development in decades, lending technological credibility to suspicions that had previously relied on eyewitness accounts and documentary analysis. Researchers who had spent years assembling timelines, interviewing witnesses, and cataloging anomalies finally felt that mainstream attention might validate their work. Yet the forensic data also highlighted the limitations of what any examination could definitively establish. Even if the coffin's contents proved anomalous, multiple explanations existed that didn't require Elvis to have survived his death. Unusual embalming practices common in the 1970s might account for unexpected density readings. Memorial items placed in the coffin alongside the body could alter weight distribution in unpredictable ways. Modifications made during the transfer of Elvis's remains from their original burial site to the meditation garden might have introduced variables that contemporary forensic models couldn't anticipate. The examination had opened doors, but walking through them required interpretive leaps that science alone could not justify. The human impact of this renewed uncertainty rippled through communities that had organized their grief around the belief that Elvis rested peacefully at Graceland. For devoted fans who had visited the meditation garden to pay respects, the suggestion that the grave might not contain what they believed felt like a violation of sacred ground. Others experienced the findings as liberating confirmation that their private doubts had been reasonable all along, that their inability to fully accept Elvis's death reflected something genuine rather than pathological denial. Then came the testimony that nobody had anticipated. Just weeks after the examination findings began circulating through research communities, a former Graceland employee reached out to investigators with claims that threatened to upend everything. This individual, now elderly and reportedly in declining health, had worked at the estate during the critical period surrounding Elvis's death and its immediate aftermath. For decades, this person had remained silent, bound by loyalty, legal agreements, or simple fear of not being believed. But the examination findings had apparently loosened something, compelling a confession that the official timeline of events contained deliberate gaps that the world had never been told about. When all the forensic data is analyzed and every theory examined under harsh light, what remains is something simpler and more profound than any conspiracy could contain. The examination of Elvis Presley's coffin revealed genuine anomalies that legitimate scientists found difficult to explain through conventional means. The density readings, the weight discrepancies, the patterns that deviated from expected burial profiles, all of this exists in documented form, analyzed by professionals with no stake in proving any particular narrative. Yet even these findings cannot deliver the definitive answer that so many have sought for nearly half a century. The technology detected something unusual, but science alone cannot bridge the gap between detection and certainty. Perhaps that ambiguity is exactly what this story was always destined to produce. Elvis Presley existed at a scale that ordinary explanations struggle to accommodate, and it seems fitting that even his death would resist the tidy conclusions we typically demand. The former Graceland employee's testimony, still being verified and analyzed by researchers, adds another layer to an already complex picture without resolving its fundamental mysteries. This individual, claims to possess knowledge about the hours following Elvis's death that contradicts official records, but claims require corroboration, and corroboration takes time. The truth, if it emerges at all, will arrive on its own schedule rather than ours. What deserves attention is not merely the question of what lies inside that coffin, but why millions of people care so desperately about the answer. Elvis Presley represented transformation in its purest form. The shy, impoverished kid from Tupelo who became the most electrifying performer the world had ever witnessed. His rise embodied possibility itself, the radical American idea that origins need not determine destinations. And when that story ended in bathroom at Graceland with a bloated, pharmaceutically ravaged body discovered by his girlfriend, it felt less like a death and more like a betrayal. The king who had conquered everything proved unable to conquer himself. And that truth carried a weight that many hearts simply refused to accept. The survival theories that have persisted across decades are not really about Elvis hiding in some quiet corner of the world, living out his days in peaceful anonymity. They are about us, about our refusal to let the story end on such a diminished note, our insistence that someone who burned so brightly deserved an exit more befitting his legend. Every reported sighting, every analyzed photograph, every examination of burial anomalies serves the same psychological function. These investigations keep Elvis present in a world that feels somehow diminished by his absence, allowing each generation to discover him anew and add their own chapter to his mythology. The examination findings, whatever their ultimate interpretation, accomplished something remarkable simply by existing. They demonstrated that nearly 50 years after Elvis Presley's reported death, the world still cares enough to deploy cutting-edge technology in pursuit of answers about his fate. That level of sustained cultural investment speaks to something deeper than celebrity obsession or conspiracy addiction. It reveals how certain figures transcend their historical moment to become permanent fixtures in our collective imagination, touchstones that each generation inherits and reinterprets according to its own needs. Elvis's genuine legacy requires no forensic verification to establish its validity. The artists who cite him as their primary influence span every genre and generation, from rock pioneers to contemporary performers who weren't born until decades after his death. The template he created for modern celebrity, the merchandising, the movies, the carefully managed public image, remains the blueprint that today's entertainment industry follows, whether consciously or not. His voice, captured in recordings that technology continues to enhance and preserve, still fills rooms with an emotional power that time has not diminished. These things are real in ways that theories about coffin contents can never match. Maybe the greatest revelation from this entire episode has nothing to do with forensic anomalies or insider testimony. Maybe what the examination truly uncovered was the depth of feeling that Elvis Presley still commands. The way his name can still make hearts beat faster and arguments erupt among strangers. In the ways that genuinely matter. In influence, in emotional connection, in the capacity to make people feel something powerful across the distance of decades. Elvis Presley never really left us at all. The mystery of what lies inside that coffin may never be completely solved, and perhaps that uncertainty is itself a gift. It ensures that the conversation continues, that new generations keep asking questions, and that the king remains exactly where he has always belonged, alive in the hearts of everyone still listening. The examination opened doors that may never fully close. What do you believe those findings actually revealed, and why does Elvis still matter so deeply after all these years? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to join us as we continue exploring the untold chapters of the King's extraordinary legacy. September 12, 2003. Johnny Cash was dying, and he knew it. 4 months after June Carter's funeral, the man in black sat in his wheelchair at his Hendersonville home, his body ravaged by diabetes,
his voice barely a whisper of the baritone that once shook the world. But his mind was sharp, tormented by something he'd carried for 26 years. Something about Elvis Presley that nobody knew. Something that would change everything we thought we understood about the king of rock and roll. Rick Rubin, Cash's producer and confidant in those final days, would later describe what happened next as the most haunting conversation of his life. Johnny had asked him to turn off the recording equipment, to put away the cameras that had been documenting his final album sessions. This wasn't for the public, not yet. But Cash couldn't die with this weight on his soul. The truth about Elvis had been eating at him since August 16, 1977, and now, with maybe days left to live, Johnny Cash was ready to break the silence he'd maintained through decades of interviews, documentaries, and biographies. What made this revelation so explosive wasn't just what Cash knew about Elvis. It was why he'd hidden it for so long, and what powerful forces had made sure this story never saw the light of day. The music industry has its share of dark secrets, but this one involved people who were still very much alive in 2003. People with everything to lose if Cash's truth got out. Johnny had already outlived most of his contemporaries, survived his own battles with drugs and demons, and buried the love of his life. He had nothing left to fear except meeting his maker with this secret unconfessed. The story Cash began to tell that September afternoon started in Memphis in a converted auto repair shop called Sun Records, where two young men from the South would forge a friendship that the world never fully understood. But it wasn't their public relationship that mattered. It was the 3 private encounters between Johnny Cash and Elvis Presley that would reveal the real tragedy of the king's life and death. These weren't the meetings captured by photographers or documented by historians. These were moments of raw truth between two men who understood fame's poison better than anyone alive. Cash's hands trembled as he spoke about the burden of being the keeper of Elvis's darkest moment. You see, everyone knew about Elvis's pills, his isolation, the bizarre lifestyle at Graceland, but Johnny knew why. He knew what had broken Elvis Presley, what had transformed him from the rebellious force of nature in 1956 to the bloated, paranoid shadow he became by 1977. And more importantly, Cash knew that Elvis had seen his own death coming, had practically predicted it down to the year, and had begged Johnny for help in a way that would haunt the country singer forever. The weight of this knowledge had affected every song Cash sang about Elvis, every tribute he'd paid, every carefully worded interview response when journalists asked about their friendship. Watch those old interviews now, knowing what Cash revealed in his final days, and you'll see it in his eyes. The struggle of a man desperate to honor his friend's memory while knowing he was participating in a massive cover-up. The same machine that had created Elvis Presley had destroyed him, and Cash had watched it happen, powerless to stop it, sworn to secrecy by forces bigger than both of them. As Johnny's voice grew weaker that September day, he made one thing crystal clear. This wasn't about scandal or selling records or settling old scores. Elvis had been dead for over a quarter century. This was about setting the record straight before Cash joined him. It was about justice for a friend who'd been portrayed as weak, self-destructive, and ultimately responsible for his own demise. The truth, according to Cash, was far more sinister. Elvis Presley hadn't just died, he'd been systematically destroyed by the very people who claimed to protect him. And Johnny Cash had evidence that would shake the music industry to its core. What Johnny revealed about that night in 1956 would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the king of rock and roll. December 4th, 1956. History books call it the $1 Million Quartet Session, that legendary afternoon when Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, and Johnny Cash found themselves together at Sun Records. The photographs from that day show 4 young men around a piano, seemingly casual, captured in what appeared to be a spontaneous jam session. But those pictures, now famous worldwide, only tell half the story. What the cameras didn't capture was what happened after Sam Phillips stopped rolling tape, after the reporters left when Elvis asked Johnny to stick around. That conversation, lasting barely an hour in Sam's empty office, would become the foundation of a secret that bound these two men until death. Elvis was 21 years old and already the biggest star in America. Cash, at 24, was still climbing, still hungry, watching his younger friend navigate fame with a mixture of admiration and growing concern. But that night, as Memphis grew dark outside the studio windows, Elvis dropped his guard completely. The swagger was gone, the sneer disappeared, and what Johnny saw was a terrified kid who'd already figured out that he'd made a deal he couldn't escape. Elvis told Cash something that night that would have destroyed his career if it had gotten out in 1956. Something about Colonel Tom Parker that even Sam Phillips didn't know yet. The Colonel had only been managing Elvis for a year, but already the cage was being built. Elvis revealed to Johnny that Parker had gambling debts that ran deeper than anyone imagined, debts that made Elvis not just a client, but collateral. The money men behind Parker weren't music industry executives. They were people who collected debts in blood, who saw Elvis as a golden goose that would pay Parker's markers for decades to come. Elvis had discovered this truth accidentally, overhearing a phone call that Parker didn't know he'd heard, and now the young singer was trapped between his dreams of stardom and the growing realization that he'd never truly be free. Cash would later recall how Elvis's hands shook as he explained the situation, how his voice dropped to a whisper, even though they were alone. This wasn't the confident rebel who'd scandalized America with his hips on television just months before. This was a young man who'd already learned that fame came with chains he couldn't break. Elvis made Johnny promise that night to keep this secret, but he also said something that would prove prophetic. He told Cash that if anything ever happened to him, if he died young, Johnny should know it wasn't just the music business that killed him. It was the business behind the business, the shadowy figures who owned pieces of him like he was a corporation rather than a human being. What made this conversation even more chilling was Elvis's clarity about his own future. He predicted, with eerie accuracy, how his life would unfold. The movies he didn't want to make but would be forced to, the artistic death that would come before his physical one, the pills that would be pushed on him to keep him performing when his body and soul wanted to quit. Elvis saw it all coming in 1956, laid it out for Johnny like he was reading from a script already written, and the most terrifying part was his resignation to it. He'd already accepted his fate at 21 years old. Sam Phillips would later admit to Cash that he'd heard part of this conversation, standing in the hallway outside his office, frozen by what he was hearing. But Sam had his own debts, his own pressures, and he chose to pretend he'd heard nothing. This would haunt the Sun Records founder for the rest of his life, knowing he could have intervened when Elvis was still young enough to escape. Instead, Phillips sold Elvis's contract to Urca and the Colonel for $35,000, essentially delivering the lamb to the slaughter. But it was what happened in 1968, at the height of Elvis's comeback, that would haunt Johnny Cash until his dying breath. 1968 should have been Elvis's resurrection year. The black leather comeback special had reminded America why they'd fallen in love with him in the first place, stripping away the Hollywood machinery to reveal the raw talent still burning underneath. But Johnny Cash knew the truth behind that triumphant return, because he'd been the one to find Elvis unconscious on the bathroom floor at Graceland just 3 weeks before filming began. What happened that night in November would never make it into any biography, never appear in any documentary, because the Colonel made sure of that with threats that went far beyond lawsuits. Cash had come to Graceland unannounced, worried about his friend after hearing disturbing reports from mutual acquaintances in Nashville. Both men were deep in their own battles with amphetamines at the time, but Johnny had June Carter pulling him back from the edge. Elvis had nobody except the doctors who kept filling prescriptions and the Colonel who needed his golden goose conscious just enough to perform. When Cash found Elvis that night, sprawled on Italian marble with foam at the corners of his mouth, he thought he was already gone. The terror of those seconds, checking for a pulse, screaming for help in a mansion full of people trained to look the other way, would replay in Johnny's nightmares for the rest of his life. The cover-up began immediately. Dr. Nick, Elvis's personal physician, arrived within minutes, almost like he'd been waiting for this call. The security team that Cash had alerted suddenly developed amnesia about the evening's events. And then Colonel Parker himself showed up at 2 a.m, not to check on Elvis, but to have a very specific conversation with Johnny Cash. That conversation, held in Elvis's office while the king lay sedated upstairs, was less a discussion and more a series of threats wrapped in cigar smoke and false concern. Parker knew about Cash's own drug problems, knew about every arrest, every close call, every moment of weakness. He made it clear that if Johnny ever spoke about what he'd seen that night, the world would hear a very different story about the man in black. But it was the second part of Parker's threat that really shook Cash. The colonel had connections that went beyond the music industry, beyond even the mob figures everyone suspected he was involved with. These were people who could make problems disappear, and Parker made it crystal clear that Johnny's family, June included, could become problems that needed solving. The most heartbreaking part of this story was what Elvis said when he finally came to, when Cash was allowed to see him briefly before being escorted off the property. Elvis grabbed Johnny's hand with surprising strength and whispered that he knew exactly what he'd taken, knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't an accidental overdose. This was a practice run. Elvis's way of seeing if anyone would actually try to save him or if they just let him die. The answer terrified both men. If Cash hadn't shown up uninvited, if he hadn't forced his way past the gates, Elvis Presley would have died in 1968, and the official story would have been natural causes or exhaustion. June Carter tried to organize an intervention after Johnny told her everything, reaching out to the Memphis Mafia, to Priscilla, to anyone who claimed to love Elvis. But the wall around the king was impenetrable. The colonel had convinced everyone that Cash was projecting his own addiction issues onto Elvis, that Johnny was unstable and jealous of Elvis's comeback. The brilliance of the manipulation was how Parker used Cash's real struggles with pills to discredit his attempts to help. Who would believe a drug addict trying to save another drug addict? By 1976, when Cash saw Elvis for the last time, the transformation was complete. The bloated figure who hugged him backstage in Las Vegas was barely recognizable, and the desperation in Elvis's eyes was mixed with resignation. Elvis pulled Johnny close and said something that would echo in Cash's mind until his own death. Johnny's voice cracked as he revealed Elvis's final words to him, words that proved Elvis knew exactly what was coming. "Johnny, I'll be dead by 42. Write me a song when I'm gone, but tell them the truth when you're ready to join me." Those were Elvis's last words to Cash in Vegas, 1976, spoken with such calm certainty that Johnny initially thought it was just the pills talking. But Elvis wasn't high that night. He was crystal clear, more lucid than he'd been in years, and he proceeded to tell Cash exactly how it would happen. Not the when, but the how. The bathroom, the heart failure, the cosmic joke of dying on a toilet like a medieval king. Elvis had been planning his own death for months, not as suicide but as the only escape from a contract that wouldn't end until he did. The financial prison Elvis described that night was more elaborate than anyone outside his inner circle could have imagined. The colonel didn't just own a percentage of Elvis's earnings. Through a web of side deals and hidden agreements, Parker had essentially sold futures on Elvis's corpse. There were insurance policies, posthumous release contracts, and merchandising deals that would only activate upon the king's death. Elvis had discovered these documents during his divorce proceedings with Priscilla, hidden in safety deposit boxes he wasn't supposed to know about. The revelation that his death was literally worth more than his life had broken whatever remained of his will to fight. Cash wrestled with this knowledge through Elvis's final year, watching from a distance as his friend grew sicker, more isolated, more resigned to his fate. The guilt of not intervening, of being held back by the Colonel's threats and his own family's safety, would become Johnny's greatest regret. When news of Elvis's death reached him on August 16, 1977, Cash locked himself in his bathroom and wept, not from surprise, but from the crushing weight of inevitability. Elvis had called his own death down to the year, 42 years old, just like he'd predicted. But the story didn't end with Elvis's funeral. 3 weeks after the burial, Cash received a package with no return address, postmarked from Memphis the day before Elvis died. Inside was a letter in Elvis's handwriting, rambling at times but coherent enough to serve as a confession and a goodbye. Elvis detailed the medications he'd been stockpiling, the specific combination he planned to take, and most disturbingly, the cooperation he'd received from certain members of his staff who'd been promised payoffs from the posthumous earnings. This wasn't just assisted suicide, this was a business transaction where Elvis's death was the product being delivered. Cash never showed that letter to anyone, not even June, but he kept it in a safe at his Hendersonville home. After Johnny's death in 2003, his son John Carter Cash found the letter along with pages of notes Johnny had written about his conversations with Elvis. The family made the decision to keep these documents private, partly out of respect for both men's legacies, but mostly because the legal implications would have destroyed too many lives. Some of the people Elvis named in his letter were still alive, still powerful, still capable of the same kind of damage the Colonel had threatened decades earlier. What Johnny Cash wanted the world to understand, what he struggled to convey in his final days, was that Elvis Presley wasn't weak. He wasn't a cautionary tale about fame and excess. He was a prisoner who chose the only exit available to him, a man who orchestrated his own death as carefully as he'd once orchestrated his performances. The tragedy wasn't that Elvis died young. It was that the music industry created a system where death became his only way to achieve freedom. Cash's final words about Elvis, spoken just days before his own death, were simple but devastating. Elvis didn't die from drugs. He died from slavery. The pills were just the method. The cause was the contract he signed when he was too young to know that fame could be a death sentence. If this story about Johnny and Elvis shocked you, wait until you hear what Cash revealed about Frank Sinatra's mob connections. Click the video on your screen right now. You won't believe what the man in black witnessed firsthand. Don't miss it. The truth is darker than you think.
I raced back home, and I think I ran every red light there was trying to get to my house, and the phone was ringing, and it kept ringing.
After 30 years, Elvis' casket has been opened. This is what they found. Nobody opens a casket after 30 years unless they're afraid of what's still inside it. That's the sentence that stopped investigators cold. That's the sentence that circulated quietly in sealed memos, in private conversations between forensic specialists, in the kind of rooms where people speak in low voices even when no one else is around. And that's the sentence that brings us here today. Because what happened when that casket was finally examined didn't just disturb the remains of the most famous man who ever walked across a stage. It disturbed the entire story America had been told for 3 decades. Let's go back to August 16th, 1977. Graceland goes quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. Elvis Aaron Presley, the man who had electrified a generation, who had made women weep and nations stand at attention, was found unresponsive on his bathroom floor. By late afternoon, the world knew. The official cause of death was delivered cleanly, almost clinically: cardiac arrhythmia, heart failure, a body that had simply given out. The press accepted it. The public mourned. And within days, the machinery of legacy kicked in. The tributes, the memorials, the carefully managed grief of an estate suddenly worth far more than it had been 24 hours earlier. But here's what didn't make the evening news. The medical examiner who conducted the original autopsy, Dr. Jerry Francisco, released his findings with a speed that several of his own colleagues found deeply unusual. There were toxicology reports still pending. There were tissue samples still being processed. And yet the cause of death was announced as though the science was already settled, as though the only thing that mattered was getting a clean answer out before the questions got too loud. Some of the physicians who reviewed the case afterward described the handling of those findings as, at best, premature. At worst, they used a different word entirely: convenient. For 30 years, that word sat in the back of the conversation like a stone in a shoe. People felt it, but couldn't quite point to it. The Elvis is alive conspiracy theories became the noise that drowned out the real signal. Because when you surround legitimate questions with absurd ones, the legitimate ones stop being taken seriously. And that is exactly what happened. Every serious medical or forensic concern about the circumstances of Elvis' death got buried under an avalanche of tabloid fiction. And the people who raised those concerns professionally were painted with the same brush as the people who claimed to see him at gas stations in Kalamazoo. Then, something shifted. 30 years after the funeral, after the horse-drawn carriage, after the 100,000 mourners who lined the streets of Memphis, a quiet process began. Not a public exhumation, not a press conference, something far more controlled than that. Documents surfaced, requests were filed, and individuals with the legal standing and the forensic credentials to ask the right questions finally got close enough to ask them. What triggered it wasn't a conspiracy theorist with a blog. It was a combination of expiring legal protections, a partial leak from sealed state records, and testimony from someone who had been inside Graceland during the final months of Elvis's life, someone who had stayed silent for decades and had finally decided that silence had a cost they were no longer willing to pay. What that person described changed the entire frame of what investigators were looking for. It wasn't about whether Elvis died on that bathroom floor. It was about what the conditions of his death revealed, and more critically, what those conditions implicated about the people around him. The people who were supposed to protect him. The people who controlled his access to the outside world, his medications, his schedule, and ultimately his fate. The casket was opened quietly. The findings were documented carefully. And when those findings came back, when the people in that room looked at what 30 years of sealed truth had preserved, they understood immediately why certain powerful people had worked so hard to make sure this moment never came. But what they found inside didn't just answer the questions people had been asking for 30 years. It ripped open an entirely new set of secrets, ones the Presley estate had spent millions making sure you'd never hear. There is a version of Elvis Presley's final 18 months that the estate approved. And then there is the version that the medical records tell. They are not the same story. The approved version goes something like this: a troubled genius, worn down by fame, struggling with his health, who ultimately succumbed to a heart that had been pushed too far. It's a tragic story, but it's a tidy one. It has no villains, it has no culpability, it has no one sitting across from a camera having to answer for what they did or didn't do, while the most famous man in the world was quietly falling apart inside a mansion in Memphis. That version of the story has generated billions of dollars in merchandise, in tourism, in licensing deals that continue to this day. It is, in every sense of the word, a product. And like every product, it was designed to sell. The real version begins with a physician named Dr. George Nichopoulos, known to everyone around Elvis simply as Dr. Nick. He was Elvis's personal doctor, his medical gatekeeper, the man who controlled what went into Elvis's body with a level of access that no single physician should ever have over any single patient. In the final 20 months of Elvis's life, Dr. Nick wrote prescriptions for Elvis at a rate that, when it was later examined by the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners, caused the room to go very quiet. We are not talking about a doctor managing a patient's chronic pain with careful oversight. We are talking about quantities of amphetamines, barbiturates, opiates, and sedatives that investigators described as staggering. One review found that in a single 8-month stretch, Elvis was prescribed more than 10,000 doses of various controlled substances, all perfectly legal, all signed off by the one man whose job it was to keep Elvis healthy, all delivered directly into a system that was already breaking down. Dr. Nick was eventually charged with over 100 counts of indiscriminate and excessive prescribing. And then, in a verdict that stunned many of the medical professionals who had followed the case, he was acquitted. The official explanation was that the prosecution hadn't sufficiently proven that the prescriptions caused direct harm. But what that verdict quietly did was close the door on a line of accountability that led directly back to Graceland. Because Dr. Nick didn't operate in a vacuum. He operated inside a system. And that system had people above him. Here is where the autopsy controversy becomes impossible to ignore. The original autopsy report, the document that should have been the definitive scientific record of how and why Elvis Presley died, was sealed by the state of Tennessee, not classified in a way that would be reviewed in 5 years, or 10, sealed for 50 years. Think about what that means. A man dies of what officials call natural causes, and the paperwork is locked away for half a century. The justification given at the time involved privacy protections for the family. But privacy protections do not typically require 50-year seals on cause of death documentation for a cardiac event. They do, however, make a great deal of sense when the documentation contains something that someone with significant influence did not want becoming public record. Over the years, fragments leaked. Former staff members talked in careful, guarded ways. A 1994 biography contained testimony from medical personnel present during the autopsy who suggested the toxicological picture was far more complicated than the official cardiac narrative allowed for. A subsequent independent medical review, conducted by physicians with no connection to the original case, concluded that the drug levels present in Elvis's system at the time of death were, in their words, inconsistent with a primary cardiac cause. That review never made the front page. It never needed to. By then, the story had already been written, copyrighted, and sold. And buried inside all of it, inside the prescriptions, the sealed files, the acquitted doctor, and the suspiciously quiet aftermath, was a name that kept appearing. Not a dealer, not a stranger, someone who sat at Elvis's dinner table every single night. There are moments in history that happen quietly. No cameras, no press releases, no one standing at a podium with a microphone. Just a small group of people in a controlled environment looking at something that was never supposed to be looked at again. The examination of Elvis Presley's casket was one of those moments, and the people who were present in that room walked out of it changed, not because of what they expected to find, but because of what they didn't. The condition of the remains told its own story before a single document was reviewed. Forensic preservation works in predictable ways, and what the examination revealed about the physical state of the body raised immediate questions about the timeline that had been constructed around Elvis's final hours. The official account placed his death in the early afternoon of August 16th, but certain physiological markers, the kind that forensic specialists are trained to read like a language, suggested that the window of death may have been significantly different from what was recorded. Not by minutes, by hours. And in a case where the circumstances surrounding those final hours were already contested, a discrepancy like that doesn't stay in the room where it's discovered. It travels. Beyond the remains themselves, what drew immediate attention were the personal items found inside the casket. This is not unusual in and of itself. It is common practice to place meaningful objects with the deceased before burial. What was unusual was that several of the items documented during the examination did not appear in any publicly known record of the burial. There was no mention of them in the accounts given by funeral home staff. There was no mention of them in the detailed descriptions provided by the handful of journalists who were permitted a brief viewing before the casket was sealed. They were there. They had been there for 30 years. And no one who had officially handled the burial could or would explain how they got there or who placed them inside. Among what was found was a sealed handwritten note. Its contents have not been fully disclosed, but individuals with direct knowledge of the examination have described it as personal in nature, addressed not to the public, not to history, but to a specific individual whose identity has been deliberately withheld. The significance of that note isn't just in what it said. It's in what it implies. That someone with access to that casket, in the hours between Elvis's death and his burial, placed something inside it that they did not want the world to see. That is not grief. That is intention. And intention, in a forensic context, is everything. Then there is the medication evidence. Residual pharmaceutical trace findings, the kind that can survive in preserved remains over extended periods under the right conditions, were consistent with substances that had not been included in the official toxicology summary. Not contradicting it entirely, but expanding it in ways that align disturbingly closely with what those independent medical reviewers had suggested years earlier. The picture that emerged wasn't of a man who had died from a heart that simply gave out. It was of a man whose body had been navigating a chemical environment so severe that the heart failure, if it occurred at all in the way described, may have been the last in a long chain of events rather than the sudden and isolated incident it was presented as. And then there is the identity question, the one that has followed this story like a shadow for 50 years. The examination did not ignore it. Forensic dental comparison was conducted. Biological markers were reviewed. What the findings confirmed, according to sources with knowledge of the process, is that the remains are consistent with Elvis Presley's documented biological profile. Consistent, not conclusive in the way that modern DNA analysis would allow, because that level of testing was not fully authorized. Which raises its own question. If the goal was to settle the record permanently, why stop short of the test that would do exactly that? But here's the part that never made the news. Here's the detail that, when it was brought to the Presley estate's attorneys, resulted in 3 phone calls, 2 NDAs, and 1 very abrupt end to the examination. And it has nothing to do with whether Elvis was alive or dead. When the examination ended, the findings didn't go public. They didn't surface in a documentary, or land on the desk of an investigative journalist, or get submitted to a congressional inquiry. 3 separate individuals connected to the examination process were contacted within 72 hours of its conclusion. Each of them was presented with a non-disclosure agreement. 2 signed immediately. The third did not, and subsequently found every professional door they had previously walked through either closed or significantly narrowed. No public accusation was made. No lawsuit was filed. Nothing that dramatic. Just the slow, suffocating pressure of influence applied in the right places at the right time, which is how powerful institutions have always dealt with knowledge they cannot afford to have circulating freely. It is not illegal. It is not even unusual, but it is deliberate. And it worked. What makes this particularly significant is the context surrounding Lisa Marie Presley, Elvis's only child, the sole heir to a legacy that was worth an estimated $500 million at the time of her death in January 2023. Lisa Marie spent much of her adult life in a complicated, painful orbit around her father's memory. She spoke publicly, on multiple occasions, about feeling disconnected from the version of Elvis that the estate projected. She described the Graceland she grew up in as something fundamentally different from the Graceland that had become a tourist destination. And in private conversations, accounts of which have surfaced through people close to her, she reportedly expressed doubts about the official narrative surrounding her father's death that went beyond the ordinary grief of a daughter who lost her parent too soon. She didn't speak in specifics, at least not publicly, but she spoke in a way that suggested she knew the specifics existed. Lisa Marie is gone now, and with her went whatever private knowledge she carried about the final chapter of her father's life. That loss matters in this story not just emotionally, but evidentially, because she was the one person whose standing, whose legal authority, and whose personal connection to Elvis Presley could have forced a level of transparency that no attorney's phone call could quietly neutralize. Instead, the estate passed to her children, and the machinery that has always controlled the Elvis narrative continues to run, smoothly and profitably, as it always has. This is the part of the story that reaches beyond Memphis, beyond 1977, beyond one man's death and one family's grief, because what happened to the truth about Elvis Presley's final months, the way it was managed, suppressed, packaged, and sold back to the public in a form that protected the brand rather than honored the man, is not an anomaly. It is a template. It is what happens when a human being becomes an industry, when the estate is worth more than the artist ever was alive, when the people controlling the legacy have a financial incentive to ensure that the legacy remains clean, uncomplicated, and commercially viable regardless of what the actual record shows. Every time the real questions got close to the surface, through a leaked document, through a former employee speaking carefully on the record, through an independent medical review that contradicted the official story, the response was never transparency. It was management. Careful, expensive, legally sophisticated management of the narrative, and it succeeded for 30 years in keeping the most uncomfortable findings exactly where they were placed, sealed, suppressed, and out of reach of the people who had the most right to know them. The fans, the public, the generation that grew up believing the version of Elvis's death that was designed to be believed. The casket was opened. The truth was disturbed. And whether or not the full story ever reaches you, that decision isn't being made by historians, it's being made by lawyers. And it always has been. If this story reached you, don't let it stop here. Share this video before it gets buried under everything they'd rather you watch instead. Subscribe if you want the truth that powerful estates spend millions keeping quiet. The king deserves better than a managed narrative, and so do you.
Earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too,
For 50 years, he said nothing. Not a word to journalists, not a whisper to documentary filmmakers, not even a confession to his own children. And when I asked him why he finally decided to talk, the answer sent a chill down my spine. He leaned back in his chair, looked me dead in the eyes, and said, "Because everyone who could hurt me is finally in the ground." The man sitting across from me is 82 years old. His hand shakes slightly when he reaches for his coffee, but his mind is sharp as a razor blade. He spent 31 years inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and for a significant portion of that career, his job involved something most Americans never knew existed. He monitored high-profile targets, not criminals in the traditional sense, not foreign spies or domestic terrorists. He watched celebrities, public figures, cultural icons whose influence had grown so massive that the government considered them potential threats to national stability. And at the top of that list, for reasons that will become horrifyingly clear, was Elvis Aaron Presley. Now, before you dismiss this as conspiracy nonsense, understand something important. The FBI's surveillance of Elvis Presley is not speculation. It is documented fact. His file, partially declassified under the Freedom of Information Act, runs over 500 pages. The Bureau tracked his movements. They monitored his associations. They intercepted his communications. What has never been explained, however, is why. Why would the most powerful law enforcement agency in America dedicate those kinds of resources to a man who sang love songs and swiveled his hips? The official explanation has always been vague. Concerns about his influence on youth, worries about his connections to controversial figures, generic bureaucratic justifications that never quite added up. The analyst I spoke with says the real reason was something else entirely, something that has been deliberately obscured for 5 decades, and it starts with a single devastating observation. Elvis Presley went quiet in his final years. Everyone knows this. The public narrative frames it as decline, depression, drug addiction. A man who had everything slowly losing his grip on reality, but the analyst sees it differently. He says Elvis didn't lose his voice. He says Elvis made a calculated decision to stop using it. There is a profound difference between a man who cannot speak and a man who chooses silence because speaking would destroy him. According to the analyst, Elvis was the latter, and the Bureau knew it. Think about what that means for a moment. The most famous entertainer on the planet, a man who could command stadiums full of screaming fans, a man whose every word was treated as gospel by millions of devoted followers, suddenly retreats into isolation. He cancels appearances, he avoids interviews, he surrounds himself with armed guards and locks himself inside Graceland like a man preparing for siege. The world assumed he was falling apart. The analyst says he was holding himself together by a thread because he understood something terrifying. He understood that the moment he opened his mouth about what he knew, his life would be measured in hours. What did he know? That question haunted me throughout our conversation. The analyst was careful about details. 50 years of bureau training does not disappear overnight, and even now, with most of the key players dead, he chose his words with surgical precision. But what he did reveal paints a picture of Elvis Presley that bears almost no resemblance to the man we think we knew. The king of rock and roll was not just a musician. By the early 1970s, through a series of circumstances that were partly ambition and partly terrible luck, Elvis had gained access to rooms he was never supposed to enter. He had heard conversations that were never meant for civilian ears. He had witnessed arrangements between powerful men that, if exposed, would have detonated like a bomb in the center of American political life. And the people involved knew he had witnessed them. The analyst described Elvis in those final years as a man living inside a prison of his own fame. He could not disappear. He was too recognizable, too beloved, too constantly watched by the public eye. But he also could not speak. The walls were closing in from both directions, and the only survival strategy available was silence. Absolute, total, suffocating silence. And here is where it gets darker. Because isolation was not enough. The people who feared what Elvis knew did not trust his quiet. They needed assurance. They needed control. And according to the analyst, they got it by placing their own people inside Elvis's inner circle. The men Elvis trusted most, the ones he called his brothers, the ones who swore they would protect him with their lives, at least 2 of them were reporting back. Elvis was not surrounded by loyalty, he was surrounded by surveillance. And he spent his final years as a prisoner in his own home, watched by the very men he believed were keeping him safe. Now, stop. Let that sink in. Because what the analyst revealed next explains why Elvis spent those final years armed to the teeth, paranoid beyond reason, unable to sleep without medication. He was not fighting imaginary demons, he was fighting real ones. And they were standing right beside him, smiling, waiting for him to make one wrong move. December 21st, 1970. The photograph is iconic. Elvis Presley standing in the Oval Office, shaking hands with President Richard Nixon, both men smiling like old friends. The official story has always played it for laughs. A drugged-out rock star, high on his own legend, waltzing into the White House to request a federal narcotics badge. Nixon, amused by the absurdity, playing along for the photo opportunity. 2 men from completely different worlds sharing a bizarre moment that meant nothing beyond its surface strangeness. The analyst says that interpretation is not just wrong. It is deliberately misleading. That meeting was not a joke. That meeting was the beginning of everything that would eventually destroy Elvis Presley. What most people do not realize is that Elvis did not simply ask for a badge that day. He asked for access. He wanted credentials that would allow him to move through certain circles without suspicion. He wanted the authority to gather information on drug trafficking networks he believed were corrupting American youth. Whether his motivations were genuine patriotism or something more complicated, the analyst could not say. What he could say was that Nixon, desperate for cultural allies during the Vietnam era, made a catastrophic miscalculation. He gave Elvis exactly what he asked for. Not a ceremonial badge, not a symbolic gesture, real credentials. Documents that opened doors Elvis Presley had no business walking through. And walk through them he did. Between 1970 and 1973, Elvis attended gatherings that existed far outside the world of entertainment. Private functions where government officials mingled with businessmen whose quiet meetings in rooms where conversations happened that were never meant to be overheard by anyone outside a very specific circle. Elvis was there because his credentials allowed him to be there. He was tolerated because his fame made him seem harmless. Who would suspect the king of rock and roll of understanding what he was hearing? But Elvis understood. Maybe not everything. Maybe not immediately. But over time, the pieces began forming a picture that should have terrified him. Names connected to names. Operations mentioned in passing that linked government agencies to figures in organized crime. Financial arrangements that flowed through channels designed to remain invisible. Elvis heard conversations about deals that would have ended careers, destroyed reputations, and potentially brought down men at the highest levels of American power. The analyst described it as accidental espionage. Elvis was not trying to gather intelligence. He was simply present in rooms where intelligence existed. But presence was enough. Memory was enough. And Elvis Presley, whatever his other flaws, had an extraordinary memory. By 1974, the Bureau had upgraded their classification of Elvis from curiosity to concern. Internal documents, which the analyst claims to have personally reviewed, described him as a passive liability. The terminology was precise. A passive liability was someone who possessed dangerous knowledge but had not yet demonstrated intent to use it. The key word was yet, because the Bureau understood something fundamental about information. It does not remain passive forever. Eventually, it finds a way out. And then Elvis made his fatal mistake. He started recording, not music, conversations. According to the analyst, Elvis began keeping audio documentation of certain interactions. Insurance, he called it. Protection against the day when someone might decide his knowledge had become too dangerous. He believed that possessing evidence would keep him safe. If anything happened to him, the recordings would surface. Mutually assured destruction. A deadlock that would protect him indefinitely. He was wrong. Catastrophically, tragically wrong. Because the moment Elvis started building his insurance policy, he transformed himself from a passive liability into an active threat, and active threats demanded active responses. The analyst paused at this point in our conversation. His eyes grew distant, like a man watching something painful replay in his memory. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. He said that Elvis never understood the world he had stumbled into. He thought evidence equaled safety. He thought powerful men played by rules. He thought his fame would shield him from consequences. But someone found out about the recordings, and the people Elvis trusted to protect him were the ones who made the phone call. Everyone remembers the decline, the bloated figure in the white jumpsuit, sweating through performances that once electrified nations, the canceled tours, the reclusiveness, the endless prescriptions. History has written Elvis Presley's final chapter as a cautionary tale about fame and excess, a brilliant man who drowned in his own appetites. But the analyst who sat across from me painted a portrait so different, so heartbreaking, that it fundamentally changes everything we think we know about those last years. Elvis did not retreat from the world because he was falling apart. He retreated because staying visible meant staying vulnerable. Every public appearance was a risk. Every interview was a potential trap. Every moment in the spotlight reminded dangerous people that he still existed, still possessed what he possessed, still represented a threat that had not been neutralized. Graceland was not a palace of excess. It was a fortress. And Elvis was not its king. He was its prisoner. The analyst explained the behavioral shifts that everyone misinterpreted. Elvis surrounded himself with firearms because he genuinely believed someone might come for him. He installed security systems that would have seemed paranoid for a head of state, led a group of associates who had been with him for years. But here is the cruel irony that makes this story unbearable. The people he trusted most, the Memphis Mafia, who swore their loyalty was unbreakable, at least 2 of them had been compromised. The analyst could not confirm whether they were directly employed by government agencies or simply connected to the networks Elvis had accidentally exposed. The distinction, he said, did not matter. What mattered was that information flowed out of Graceland with disturbing regularity. Elvis's movements, his mental state, his occasional drunken comments about what he knew and what he might someday reveal. Everything was reported. Everything was cataloged. Elvis thought he was surrounded by brothers. He was surrounded by surveillance wearing familiar faces. And the prescriptions. God, the prescriptions. The public has always assumed Elvis was an addict who lost control, a man chasing highs until the highs consumed him. The analyst sees it differently. He believes Elvis was self-medicating against terror. Imagine living every single day knowing that powerful men wanted you silent. Imagine understanding that your closest friends might be your greatest enemies. Imagine lying awake at night, listening for footsteps, wondering if tonight was the night someone decided the risk had grown too great. That kind of fear does not produce insomnia. It produces psychological destruction. The pills were not about pleasure. They were about survival. They were the only thing standing between Elvis and complete mental collapse. The analyst told me something that has haunted me since the moment I heard it. In 1976, approximately 1 year before his death, Elvis confided in someone he believed he could trust. He said he had enough on tape to bring down half of Washington. Those were his exact words. Enough to bring down half of Washington. Whether that was exaggeration or literal truth, the analyst could not say. But what he could confirm was that the person Elvis confided in reported that statement within 48 hours. The information went up a chain that ended in rooms Elvis himself had once been foolish enough to enter. After that conversation, Elvis's prescription intake increased dramatically. His isolation deepened. His paranoia, which everyone dismissed as drug-induced delusion, intensified beyond anything he had previously displayed. The analyst believes this was not coincidence. He believes Elvis understood, perhaps for the first time with complete clarity, that his insurance policy had failed. The recordings that were supposed to protect him had instead painted a target on his back. The people who wanted him silent now knew exactly how dangerous his silence actually was. Elvis Presley did not fade away in those final months. He was being suffocated, slowly, deliberately, by people who smiled at him, who laughed at his jokes, who called him friend and brother, while methodically tightening the grip around his throat. He could not escape. He could not fight back. He could only wait, medicated into numbness, hoping that his silence would be enough to buy him another day. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. So why now? That question burned in my mind throughout every moment of our conversation. This man had carried these secrets for half a century. He had watched documentaries that told the wrong story. He had read books that painted Elvis as a self-destructive cautionary tale. He had seen the truth buried under layers of convenient narrative, and he had said nothing. For 50 years, absolute silence. So what changed? The analyst leaned forward when I asked him directly. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, and what he said explained everything. He told me that for decades, speaking would have been suicide. Not metaphorical suicide, not career suicide, actual death. The people involved had long memories and longer reach. They had demonstrated repeatedly what happened to individuals who talked out of turn. He had watched colleagues who asked too many questions find themselves reassigned to career-ending posts. He had seen men who pushed too hard suffer accidents that were never investigated. He had understood, with the clarity that only comes from witnessing consequences firsthand, that survival meant keeping his mouth shut. But time changes everything. The men who made those decisions are gone now. The networks that enforce silence have crumbled. The power structures that once seemed invincible have been replaced by new power structures with different priorities. The analyst is 82 years old. His children are grown. His wife passed 3 years ago. He has nothing left to protect except the truth, and he has decided that the truth deserves to finally breathe. What he revealed about the aftermath of Elvis's death confirms the darkest suspicions anyone has ever harbored about that August morning in 1977. Elvis was found unresponsive in his Graceland bathroom. The official response was swift, perhaps too swift. Within hours, before any proper investigation could be conducted, the cause of death was attributed to cardiac arrhythmia. Case closed. No questions asked. No deeper examination required. A 42-year-old man with no history of heart disease simply dropped dead, and the medical establishment accepted this explanation without hesitation. The analyst says the speed was not coincidental, it was coordinated. People who needed this story to end quickly made certain it ended quickly. The investigation that should have happened was strangled in its crib, and anyone who raised objections found their concerns dismissed as conspiracy thinking. But the real operation happened inside Graceland itself. The analyst believes that within hours of Elvis's death, before the body was even cold, people entered that house who had no business being there. They were not mourners. They were not family. They were professionals conducting a specific mission. The recordings Elvis had accumulated over years of careful paranoia, the insurance policy he believed would protect him forever, vanished completely. Tapes that should have existed were never found. Documents that Elvis had referenced in conversations simply disappeared. Graceland was not just mourned that day, it was sanitized. And here is what makes this truly unforgivable. The prescriptions that flooded Elvis's system in those final months did not appear by accident. Someone ensured he had access to whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it. The very drugs that were slowly killing him flowed through channels that could have been disrupted at any moment. They were not disrupted. They were enabled. The analyst believes this was not neglect. It was strategy. Keep Elvis medicated enough to remain passive. Keep him isolated enough to remain invisible. Keep him drowning slowly so that when the end finally came, it would look like exactly what everyone expected. Another celebrity who could not handle fame. Another tragic waste. Another story with a convenient ending that required no further questions. Elvis Presley was not murdered in the traditional sense. No one held a gun to his head. No one slipped poison into his drink. The operation was far more elegant than that. He was managed into oblivion, surrounded by handlers who reported his every word, supplied with chemicals that accelerated his deterioration, isolated from anyone who might have helped him fight back. And when the combined weight of fear and drugs and loneliness finally crushed him, the people responsible simply stepped back and let nature take its course. The world remembers Elvis as a cautionary tale. The analyst believes he should be remembered as something else entirely. A man who stumbled into darkness he never understood. A man who tried to protect himself with evidence that only made him more dangerous. A man who chose silence because silence was the only weapon he had left. And a man whose silence, in the end, could not save him from people who had already decided he knew too much. The king did not leave the building voluntarily. He was shown the door by men whose names we will never know, whose faces never appeared in photographs, whose fingerprints were carefully wiped from every surface. And for 50 years, they have slept peacefully, confident that their secrets died with him, until now. If this story changed how you see Elvis Presley, you are not alone. The truth has been waiting 50 years for someone to listen. Subscribe to this channel because we are just getting started. More revelations are coming. Like this video and share it with someone who deserves to know what really happened to the king.
Every little town here, Longview, man, you name it, I've been there. You know. Really, I've been all over Texas.
What do you think of Texas?
I like it. I like it.
48 years. That's how long this aircraft sat untouched on the grounds of Graceland, its windows darkened, its cabin sealed tighter than a tomb. And when they finally pried open that door in 2025, the first thing that hit them wasn't dust. It wasn't decay. It was the unmistakable smell of 1977, leather, cologne, and something else. Something that made every single person on that recovery team stop dead in their tracks. This wasn't supposed to happen. This jet was never meant to be opened again. And once you understand why, you'll realize that what they found inside isn't just terrifying. It's heartbreaking in ways that'll change how you see Elvis Presley forever. Let me take you back to August 16, 1977. The world had just lost its king. Graceland was swarmed with mourners, journalists, and chaos that nobody could control. But while the mansion became ground zero for public grief, something else was happening quietly on the property. A decision was being made about the Lisa Marie, Elvis's custom Convair 880, the private jet he'd named after the only person on Earth he trusted completely. His daughter. See, most people assume the jet was simply parked and forgotten after Elvis died. That's the story Graceland wants you to believe. But here's what actually happened. Within 72 hours of Elvis's death, Priscilla Presley personally ordered that aircraft sealed. Not stored, not maintained, sealed. She had the doors locked, the windows covered, and gave explicit instructions that nobody, not staff, not family, not even Lisa Marie herself, was to set foot inside that cabin. For nearly 5 decades that order held, and nobody ever asked why. Until now. The Lisa Marie wasn't just a private jet. Calling it that is like calling Graceland a house. This aircraft was Elvis's escape pod, his sanctuary in the sky, the one place where he could disappear from everyone who wanted a piece of him. He'd spent over $1 million customizing it in 1975, and we're talking 1975 money. That's nearly $6 million today. Gold-plated seatbelts, a bedroom with a queen-sized bed draped in blue velvet, a conference room where he'd hold meetings he didn't want anyone to know about. This plane was more than transportation. It was the physical manifestation of Elvis's inner world, the version of himself he never showed the public. And that's exactly what made it so dangerous to open. When the preservation team finally entered that cabin earlier this year, they expected to find memorabilia. Maybe some old costumes, a few photographs, the kind of stuff you'd see in any Graceland exhibit. What they didn't expect was to find the aircraft exactly as Elvis had left it on his final flight. And I mean exactly. His reading glasses were still sitting on the armrest of his favorite seat. A half-finished book lay open on the table, spine cracked to a page he'd never returned to. The coffee cup he'd been drinking from was still in its holder, the remnants inside long since fossilized into something unrecognizable. It was like walking into a crime scene where time itself had been murdered. But here's where things start to shift from fascinating to genuinely unsettling. The team noticed something almost immediately. The items inside that cabin weren't random. They weren't scattered the way you'd expect from someone who used this jet casually. Everything was positioned with intention, organized, prepared, as if Elvis had been getting ready for something specific. The flight logs confirmed it. That jet was being fueled and prepped for a departure scheduled for August 17, 1977. A destination that, according to official records, was listed only as private. Elvis died on August 16th. One day before he was supposed to board this aircraft and fly somewhere that nobody in his inner circle has ever been willing to discuss. Think about that for a second. In the final hours of his life, Elvis Presley had a plane waiting. Bags that we now know were already packed. A flight plan filed to a destination that remains classified to this day. And nobody, not his family, not his biographers, not the countless documentaries made about his life, has ever explained where he was going or why. What was the king running from? Or maybe the better question is, who was he running from? The team continued deeper into the cabin that day, documenting everything with the kind of precision usually reserved for archaeological digs. They photographed the cockpit, the bedroom, the bathroom with its custom fixtures. They cataloged books, clothing, personal effects that hadn't seen sunlight since Gerald Ford was president. But the first thing they found when they opened that main cabin door, it wasn't gold records. It wasn't jumpsuits or jewelry or anything you'd expect from the most famous entertainer in history. It was something that made grown men step back in silence. Something that would take investigators weeks to fully understand. And trust me, you're not ready for what it was. The first thing that stopped the investigation team cold was sitting right there on the main cabin table. Prescription bottles. Not one or two, but 17 separate containers arranged in a neat semicircle, each one positioned label forward as if ready for inspection. These weren't tossed carelessly into a bag or hidden away in shame. They were displayed, organized with the kind of precision that spoke to ritual, to dependency, to a man who had built his entire daily existence around what was inside those bottles. The labels told a story that medical examiners had theorized about for decades, but never confirmed until this moment. Painkillers prescribed by doctors who never coordinated with each other, sedatives from physicians in 3 different states, uppers to get him through performances, downers to let him sleep afterward, and one bottle that contained pills nobody on that team could immediately identify, pills that weren't manufactured by any pharmaceutical company they recognized. But it wasn't just the medication that disturbed them. It was what sat next to those bottles that changed everything. A Bible, worn soft from handling, its leather cover cracked and faded from years of desperate grip. The team opened it carefully, expecting to find a family heirloom or perhaps a prop kept for sentimental value. What they discovered instead sent chills through every person in that cabin. The Bible was open to the book of Psalms, specifically Psalm 88. For those who don't know it, Psalm 88 is considered the darkest passage in Scripture. It speaks of being abandoned by God, of feeling trapped in darkness with no escape, of crying out for help that never comes. And in the margins, written in Elvis's own unmistakable handwriting, were notes. Questions. Please scrawled in ink that had faded but never disappeared. He'd underlined one verse 3 times. You have taken from me friend and neighbor. Darkness is my closest companion. This wasn't the Bible of a man at peace. This was the Bible of a man who felt utterly alone in a world that wouldn't stop watching him. Near the bedroom entrance, the team found photographs, not the glamorous shots you'd expect from a superstar. These weren't concert images or movie stills or pictures with presidents and celebrities. These were small, intimate photographs that Elvis clearly looked at often enough to keep within arm's reach during every flight. Lisa Marie as an infant, sleeping in his arms with a peace neither of them would know again. Priscilla before everything fell apart, smiling at him with love that hadn't yet turned to exhaustion. And his mother Gladys, the photograph so worn at the edges that his fingerprints had literally erased portions of the image over time. He kept the people he'd lost closest to him, the people the fame had taken away. Hanging in the small closet adjacent to the bedroom, investigators found something that broke the hearts of even the most seasoned team members. A white jumpsuit, still wrapped in its original plastic covering, tags still attached. It had been custom designed for a performance scheduled in Portland, Oregon, a show that was supposed to happen in late August 1977. A show that Elvis would never live to perform. That jumpsuit hung there for 48 years, waiting for a body that would never wear it, preserved in plastic like a ghost that refused to move on. And then there was the phone. The jet's custom communication system had been state-of-the-art for its time, allowing Elvis to make calls from 30,000 feet when such technology seemed like science fiction. The team pulled the records, expecting nothing usable after nearly 5 decades. But the backup systems had preserved one crucial detail. The last number dialed from that aircraft. It wasn't Priscilla. It wasn't his manager, Colonel Tom Parker. It wasn't any of the Memphis Mafia members who supposedly had his back. The last call Elvis made from his private sanctuary was to a number that investigators traced to a private security firm, one that specialized in extractions. And then they found the compartment. The hidden one. The one built into the floor beneath custom paneling that even Priscilla never knew existed. What was inside would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the king's final days. The compartment was built to disappear. Custom panels matched the cabin flooring so precisely that 48 years of investigators, maintenance crews, and family members had walked directly over it without ever suspecting a thing. It took a structural engineer 3 hours to locate the release mechanism, a small brass lever disguised as part of the decorative trim running along the baseboard. When that panel finally swung open, the team found themselves staring into a space roughly the size of a small suitcase, lined with velvet that had somehow survived the decades without significant deterioration. What was inside made everyone step back from the aircraft entirely. Cash. Bundled stacks of $100 bills wrapped in plastic and packed with the kind of precision that suggested professional handling. The team counted it 3 separate times, unable to believe the total. $140,000 in 1977 currency. Adjusted for today, that's nearly $750,000 in untraceable cash that Elvis Presley had hidden beneath his own feet. Money that nobody in his family, his management, or his inner circle had ever known existed. But the cash wasn't what disturbed them most. Beneath the money sat a passport. Not the famous diplomatic passport Elvis had received for his international tours, the one displayed proudly in Graceland's museum. This was different. This passport bore a different name entirely. The photograph was unmistakably Elvis, but the identity documents told a story of a man preparing to become someone else. Someone who could board a plane and vanish into a world where nobody knew his face or wanted anything from him. The implications hit the team like a freight train. Elvis Presley, the most recognizable human being on the planet in 1977, had been preparing to disappear. Tucked beside the passport were letters, 7 of them, each sealed in individual envelopes, each addressed to someone different. One bore Priscilla's name in handwriting that trembled slightly at the edges. Another was addressed to Colonel Tom Parker with a single word written beneath the name. A word that investigators have refused to publicly disclose but sources describe as profoundly hostile. The remaining letters went to various members of the Memphis Mafia, the inner circle that had surrounded Elvis for decades. But one letter stood apart from the others. Smaller, written on different paper, addressed simply to my Lisa with a small heart drawn beside her name. That letter remains sealed to this day by direct order of the Presley estate. What the opened letters revealed painted a portrait of a man living in constant fear. Elvis had become convinced that his inner circle had been compromised. He wrote about phone calls being monitored, about conversations repeated back to him by people who shouldn't have known them, about Colonel Tom Parker's increasingly aggressive financial demands and the contracts that had trapped Elvis in a career he no longer controlled. The investigation team also found a small recording device with a single cassette tape inside. The tape had degraded significantly over the decades, but audio specialists managed to recover approximately 4 minutes of usable material. What they heard was Elvis's voice, speaking quietly as if afraid of being overheard, describing arrangements he'd made with people outside his normal circles, mentioning locations, dates, names that don't appear anywhere in official Elvis documentation. He was planning something that required untraceable money, a false identity, and complete secrecy from everyone who claimed to love him. The flight scheduled for August 17th suddenly made terrible sense. Elvis wasn't planning a vacation or a business trip. He was planning an extraction, a permanent exit from the life that had become his prison. And someone, perhaps multiple someones, had reason to ensure that flight never happened. Did Elvis Presley simply die of natural causes the night before his planned escape? Or did someone with everything to lose make absolutely certain that the king would never leave his throne alive? But there's one more thing they found in that compartment. Something so personal, so haunting, that when Lisa Marie was finally shown it decades later, she couldn't speak for 3 days. Lisa Marie Presley was 9 years old when her father died, 9 years old when the world took ownership of a man she'd barely begun to know. For decades, she carried the weight of being Elvis's daughter, while simultaneously grieving the father she'd lost before she could truly understand him. And then, in 2019, she finally walked into the aircraft that bore her name. Nobody knows exactly what happened during that visit. The estate has never released footage or detailed accounts of Lisa Marie's time inside the cabin. But sources close to the family describe a woman who entered that jet composed and determined, ready to finally confront her father's ghost. She emerged 3 hours later, unable to form complete sentences. Her hands shook so violently that security had to help her into a waiting vehicle. For 3 days afterward, Lisa Marie Presley didn't speak to anyone. Not her children, not her closest friends, not the estate managers who needed her guidance on how to proceed with the aircraft's contents. Whatever she found in that cabin, whatever she read or touched or finally understood about her father, it broke something inside her that never fully healed. The item that shattered her was the letter. The small envelope addressed to my Lisa with the heart drawn beside her name. The estate eventually confirmed that Lisa Marie opened it during her visit, that she read words her father had written specifically for her eyes nearly 42 years after his death. Words he'd intended to give her personally, perhaps during that flight scheduled for August 17th. Words that fate ensured she'd never receive from his hands. Those close to her say the letter contained Elvis's confession, not of crimes or scandals, but of failures. He wrote about the father he'd wanted to be versus the father fame had forced him to become. He described watching her play at Graceland while knowing he couldn't give her the normal childhood she deserved. But most devastatingly, he wrote about dying young. Elvis apparently knew. Whether through intuition, medical warnings he'd ignored, or something darker he sensed closing in around him, the letter made clear that Elvis Presley did not expect to survive much longer. He wrote to Lisa Marie as a man saying goodbye. He wrote instructions for the kind of woman he hoped she'd become. Lisa Marie Presley died in January 2023, just 4 years after reading her father's final words. She was 54 years old. The same heart problems that plagued Elvis ultimately claimed his daughter, as if the Presley bloodline carried a curse that fame only accelerated. She never publicly discussed what that letter contained. She took its secrets with her to the grave at Graceland, where she now rests beside the father she spent her entire life trying to understand. The jet sits at Graceland today, restored and displayed for visitors who will never grasp its true significance. The cash was cataloged and secured. The passport was locked away in estate archives. Most of the letters remain sealed, their contents deemed too personal or too damaging for public consumption. But certain items from that hidden compartment will never be displayed, will never be photographed, will never leave the private vaults beneath Graceland's museum. Staff members who work the night shift tell stories they're not supposed to share. Stories about lights flickering inside the Lisa Marie's cabin when no one is aboard. About music playing softly through speakers that aren't connected to any power source. About the unmistakable scent of cologne drifting through sealed doors on August evenings when the humidity hangs heavy over Memphis. Elvis lived surrounded by millions who adored him yet died more alone than any of them could imagine. But inside that jet, frozen in time for 48 years, we finally discovered who he really was beneath the jumpsuits and the gold records and the mythology. A man who wanted to escape. A father who never got to say goodbye. A king whose crown had become his cage. And honestly, that might be the most terrifying discovery of all. What do you think Elvis wrote in that final letter to Lisa Marie? Drop your theory in the comments because I read every single one. And if this story gave you chills, subscribe now because we're just getting started. Graceland's sealed vault contains secrets that'll shake you even harder. Next week, we're going in.